If Jesus Christ, the man who overturned tables in the Temple of Jerusalem, walked into most churches today, he wouldn't sit quietly and smile. No, he'd flip tables, he'd break the silence, and he'd call out every single thing that dishonors God's house. 2,000 years ago, Jesus walked into a place that was supposed to be sacred, the temple of God. But what did he find? Not worship, not reverence. Instead, he saw greed, corruption, and hypocrisy. Men turning his Father's house into a market, a den of thieves. And in one of the most explosive moments of his ministry, Jesus did something that shocked everyone. He flipped tables, he scattered their money, and with a whip of cords, he drove them out, shouting, "My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers." But that was then. What about now? What would Jesus say if he walked into your church today? Would he nod approvingly? Or would he see the same greed, the same exploitation, and the same empty worship? Because here's the truth. The same problems that made Jesus flip tables back then are alive and thriving in many churches today. They just look a little different. In some churches, faith has become a business. Pastors have become celebrities. The gospel has been watered down to fill seats, sell books, and collect donations. And Jesus, the Jesus who walked among the poor, healed the broken, and stood up to the powerful, he's been pushed to the sidelines, replaced by entertainment, wealth, and empty rituals. If you think I'm exaggerating, keep watching. By the time this video ends, you'll see why Jesus would storm into our churches today and flip every table in sight. Let's go back to where it all began, the temple, because to understand Jesus' anger, you have to see what he saw and why it matters now more than ever. Picture this. It's the time of Passover, one of the holiest days of the year. Thousands of people have traveled from across the region to worship at the temple in Jerusalem, the center of God's presence. But as Jesus approaches, he doesn't hear prayers. He doesn't see reverence. Instead, he hears shouting, arguing, and the loud clatter of coins on stone tables. This is supposed to be the house of God, a place where people come to connect with their Creator. But instead, it's a marketplace. The poor are charged ridiculous prices for doves they can barely afford to sacrifice. Travelers are forced to exchange their currency at unfair rates just to worship. It's loud, it's greedy, it's corrupt, and worst of all, the religious leaders, the very men who should protect this sacred space, are at the sloughing it, benefiting from it. And in that moment, Jesus, the Prince of Peace, does something no one expects. It is written, "My house will be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves." Imagine the shock. The religious leaders who pride themselves on piety stand frozen in embarrassment. The merchants, so comfortable in their greed, scramble to pick up what's left of their profits. And the people, those who had been exploited for so long, watch with awe. Because finally, someone is standing up for what's right. Finally, someone is challenging the corruption that everyone else ignored. But this wasn't just about money. This wasn't just about a few greedy merchants. It was about something deeper, something far more dangerous. The temple was no longer a house of prayer. It had become a symbol of everything Jesus stood against: hypocrisy, corruption, and empty religion. Jesus didn't care about wealth. He didn't care about money. He cared about the kingdom and its representatives on earth. The temple Jesus cleansed wasn't just a building, it was a reflection of the people who worshiped there. Their hearts had strayed. The love for God was replaced with a love for power, money, and control. But here's the question no one wants to ask. What about today? Because the truth is, the temple is still here. It just looks different. Jesus flipped tables because the temple was being turned into a place of profit and pride, not prayer. Now look around you. What do you see? Churches that resemble concert halls, where the loudest applause is for the preacher, not the Savior. Ministries obsessed with numbers, how many seats are filled, how much money was raised, while souls are starving for truth. Leaders who preach prosperity to the wealthy while the poor are ignored. Faith that's been packaged, marketed, and sold like any other product. Does this look familiar? Isn't this the same marketplace Jesus flipped tables over? The selling of sacrifices has been replaced with selling salvation, but the motive is the same: profit. Back then, merchants exploited the poor to fatten their own pockets. Today, preachers build empires while telling struggling families that God will bless them if they just give a little more. Jesus came to heal the brokenhearted, to set captives free, and to lift up the oppressed. But instead of following his mission, some churches today have turned faith into entertainment. They've turned worship into performance, and they've turned God's people into customers. If Jesus walked in today, would he find prayer, humility, and love? Or would he see a den of thieves, just like before? This is not about all churches. There are still places where God is honored, where truth is preached, and where lives are transformed. But we cannot ignore what's happening. We cannot pretend that Jesus would sit quietly in the back pew, smiling as his name is used to sell dreams and demand money. No, he would stand up, he would call it out, and he would flip tables again. Because if we're honest, the modern temple looks far too much like the one Jesus cleansed. And the question remains, what would he say to us now? Maybe it's time to ask ourselves a harder question. Not just about churches, but about our own hearts. Jesus didn't flip tables for the sake of drama. He did it because corruption had invaded a place that was supposed to be holy. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. The temple back then wasn't just a building. It represented the people's hearts, their priorities, their relationship with God. And today, the same thing is happening. Before we criticize the church leaders or the modern megachurches, we have to look closer at ourselves. If Jesus were to enter the temple of our hearts today, what would he find? Would he see humility, love, and devotion? Or would he find tables that need to be overturned? Let's talk about the tables we've built. The table of greed, where money and success have replaced trust in God. The table of pride, where we crave the spotlight more than we seek God's glory. The table of distraction, where our screens and schedules drown out his voice. And let's not forget the table of hypocrisy, where we act holy on Sunday, but live for ourselves the rest of the week. This is where it gets personal. Because Jesus' message wasn't just for the Pharisees or the merchants. It was for everyone. For you. For me. He's asking us, where have you turned my Father's house, your heart, into something it was never meant to be? If you feel uncomfortable right now, that's a good thing. It means you're listening. Jesus didn't flip tables to condemn people. He flipped them to wake them up, to pull them out of their spiritual sleep and remind them what really matters. The beauty of the gospel is this: Jesus doesn't just destroy what's wrong, he restores what's right. He doesn't flip tables out of anger alone. He flips them to clear a path back to truth, back to humility, back to God. It's time to flip the tables in our own lives, to tear down the idols we've built, to clear out the distractions. Because when Jesus flipped those tables, he wasn't just cleansing a building, he was pointing us to a deeper kind of worship, a worship that's real, a faith that's alive, a temple that's pure. So I'll ask you again, if Jesus walked into your heart today, what tables would he overturn? And more importantly, What are you going to do about it? He's calling. Are you ready to answer? We've walked through the temple, we've seen the tables, both in the past and in our hearts today. But this is where everything shifts, because Jesus didn't flip tables just to leave chaos behind. He did it to make space for something greater. Do you remember what he said after flipping the tables? My house shall be called a house of prayer. Those words hold the key. Jesus wasn't just rejecting what was wrong, he was calling us back to what's right. True worship. Authentic faith, a real living connection with God. True worship doesn't depend on the size of the building or the grandeur of the service. It's not about lights, sounds, or numbers. It's about your heart. Worship happens when a broken soul finds healing, when a sinner discovers forgiveness, when a wandering heart returns to the Father and bows before Him in spirit and in truth. But how can we worship God when our tables are crowded with everything else? We say we trust Him, yet we obsess over wealth. We say we love Him, but we can't put down our distractions. We say we follow Him, yet our hearts chase after pride, power, and approval. Jesus is calling us to flip the tables ourselves, to tear down the idols we've allowed to sit where He belongs, because real worship starts when we make room for Him. This isn't about guilt, it's about freedom. When Jesus flips the tables in our hearts, He doesn't leave emptiness. He fills us with something better: peace, purpose, joy, a deeper relationship with Him. True worship doesn't need smoke and lights. It doesn't require wealth or fame. It starts when a heart says, "Here I am, Lord, I'm yours." Because when we flip the tables, when we tear down the distractions and return to Him, we find what our souls were searching for all along. So what about you? What table do you need to flip? What idol needs to go? What is standing between you and true worship? Jesus is still flipping tables today, not to condemn us, but to save us, to wake us up, to set us free, and He's waiting for you, for me, for all of us to come home. Will you answer the call? We started this journey in a temple, tables overturned, coins scattered, voices raised in anger. But what if that moment wasn't just for the merchants, the Pharisees, or the crowd? What if Jesus was pointing to something bigger? Something He wanted for us today. Throughout history, humanity has always faced the same struggle. We build tables tables of greed, pride, distraction, and compromise. But here's the truth. God doesn't share his temple. He didn't share it in Jerusalem, and he won't share it in your heart. Maybe you've built your own tables without even realizing it. Maybe you've let money take his place, or approval, or comfort. Maybe you've gotten so busy with religion that you've forgotten about relationship. But here's the good news. Jesus isn't waiting for you to be perfect. He's waiting for you to be willing to let go, willing to flip the tables, willing to make room for him. When we let Jesus into our hearts, when we let him flip the tables, he doesn't leave emptiness behind. He fills it with hope, with purpose, with his presence, because a heart cleansed of idols becomes a temple where God himself dwells. So here's the question I leave with you. Will you keep building tables that don't last, or will you let Jesus flip them and make space for what truly matters? True worship, true faith, a true relationship with the one who loves you more than you could ever know. It starts now. Flip the tables, open your heart, and let him in. He's waiting.